Hello and welcome to video 2 in the online virtual lessons. This lesson is all about cell transport, specifically diffusion. How do we smell food? Often you can be in a completely different room and you can smell what's being cooked in the oven, and it's because smells spread. Those smelly particles spread from one place to another. Now, if we think back to the three states of matter, the particles in a solid, they vibrate around a fixed position, so they jiggle a little bit, but no major movement. A liquid moves a lot more, it goes with the flow, and a gas is bouncing off the walls, it's moving a lot, it's really, really quick. So the smelly particles on our food is given off as a gas, so we already know that those particles are going to be able to move around a room. And if you visualize those particles on the food in the picture, they're going to be able to spread from one place to another. And that's how you can be in a completely different room, yet you're able to smell what's in a kitchen or a bathroom. On the diagram here, you can see particles before and after diffusion. So the particles are all clumped together. Imagine that you've sprayed some aftershave. It's really clumped together and eventually it spreads around the room. So diffusion means that the smelly particles spread through a room on their own. No energy is needed for this, it just happens. It goes with the flow automatically. On the diagram here again, you can see that we have a high concentration of particles on the left and none on the right. And you can see that the particles on the left are travelling, they're spreading from the left to the right. Now, the net movement, which just means the total movement of particles from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration, is how we describe diffusion. It's due to that random movement of particles when they're bouncing off different surfaces. They collide with each other, which is how they're able to spread from one place to another. As I said before, no energy is needed. It's a very passive process. So the smells in a kitchen spread throughout the house with no energy required. If you imagine spraying perfume or aftershave or deodorant in a corner of a room, you'll get a burst of particles, a really high concentration of particles in that area. Now, if we have two people, person A and person B, it's common sense that person A is going to smell it before person B. And that's because it's going to take much longer for those particles to spread to where person B is. And that's how sometimes somebody can smell a bad smell before the person sat next to them can, because it hasn't quite spread or travelled through the air towards them. There's a question on this slide, which is, why do you think diffusion can happen in liquids? So I want you to pause and write down for me why. So to answer this question, we need to think back to particle theory again, specifically liquids. So like in a gas, the particles are able to move around and flow around each other. Not quite as quick as a gas, but much more than a solid. That means that if you drop something like coffee or tea or squash in the corner, if you don't stir it, you'll see it spread throughout the container because it's free moving. That's why particles in a solid do not diffuse, because there isn't that movement. So to diffuse, the particles need to be able to move to spread from one area to another. Diffusion is a really important process in our bodies, but particularly in our cells. Dissolved substances have to pass through a partially permeable cell membrane to get in or out of our cells. Partially permeable just means it lets some things through and not others. If you imagine your front door, you can fit through that, but a sumo wrestler perhaps couldn't, or an elephant couldn't fit through that door. So it'll let smaller things through, but the big things won't fit. Diffusion is one of these processes that allow substances to move into and out of cells. The other two processes will be in a later video. Now, I want you to think about what substances I'm talking about here, so pause the video and write them down for me. So in order to answer that question, we need to look at the main examples of diffusion. For us, it's respiration, getting raw materials into our cells like glucose and oxygen, and the waste products out, which is carbon dioxide and water. So they are getting in and out of our cells. In a plant, the example is photosynthesis. Water and carbon dioxide need to get into plant cells, and oxygen, which is the plant's waste product, needs to get out. So the answer to the question is glucose, oxygen, carbon dioxide and water. They're the main things that diffuse in and out of cells. So this is the part of diffusion that's a little bit tricky to understand sometimes, and that's concentration gradients. A concentration gradient is the difference in concentration of a substance between two locations, e.g. across a membrane. If we look at the image on the left, you'll see there's a lot of particles on one side and only two on the other side. There's a really big difference between the two sides. We call this a high concentration gradient, which means diffusion will happen a lot quicker. That's because those particles are going to be moving around trying to reach equilibrium or a balance. On the image on the right, you can see they're a little bit more evenly balanced, so there's only one particle difference between the two sides. So diffusion will still happen, but it's a low concentration gradient because there's not as big of a difference. So diffusion will happen a lot slower. Try and visualize it like an empty room that smells very, very clean. If you sprayed perfume in the corner, you'd be able to smell it really quickly on the other side because it's quite different. However, if it's a room where everybody's been spraying different smells of perfumes, if you spray yours, it will diffuse, but it'll happen a lot slower because there's so many different things in there. Little diagram here talking about concentration gradients. You see this a lot in revision books. Again, particles on the left have a lot, the particles on the right there's only a couple. So the particles will move down the concentration gradient from a high concentration, which is on the left, to a low concentration, which is on the right. So earlier in the video, we talked about oxygen and carbon dioxide being some of the main things that diffuse in and out of cells. And that's because respiration relies on diffusion. Oxygen in inhaled air diffuses through the lungs and into the bloodstream. The oxygen is then transported throughout the body, and hopefully you know that that's by our red blood cells. Carbon dioxide is the waste gas produced by respiration. Carbon dioxide diffuses from our body's tissues into the bloodstream and is exhaled via the lungs. Video here and answer the question, where does gas exchange take place in the lungs? So, gas exchange in the lungs happens in the alveoli. And alveoli are tiny air sacs at the end of our bronchioles. It's where gas exchange occurs. It's where the deoxygenated blood full of carbon dioxide will diffuse into the alveoli from the capillary, and where the oxygenated blood will travel to the rest of our body. And that's because air will enter our alveoli and diffuse through the alveoli into the capillary. You can see on the diagram that there is just one cell on the alveoli and the capillary. Capillaries are one cell thick, meaning that diffusion happens really, really quickly because there isn't much of a distance for it to travel. And you can see here the various parts being labelled. In plants, it's the reverse of respiration, which is photosynthesis. So you'll notice first things first, the equation carbon dioxide plus water is oxygen and glucose. If you flip that around the other way, it's the equation for aerobic respiration, which is very convenient because we give out the waste that plants need and vice versa. So carbon dioxide diffuses in through the stomata, and these are these tiny little holes you can see on the diagram on the right, which are on the very bottom of our leaf. Carbon dioxide goes in and oxygen and water diffuse out. It's a little bit like the gates on a leaf, which is hard to imagine because they're so tiny you can't see them with your naked eye. During photosynthesis, the level of carbon dioxide inside the leaf is quite low. And you can see this here. I've shown this with three little yellow particles which represent carbon dioxide. This creates a big concentration gradient, so carbon dioxide diffuses into the cell. So the carbon dioxide that's on the left is going to diffuse into the leaf quite quickly because that difference is quite high. The concentration gradient is high, and it will move from the high concentration to the low concentration inside the leaf. Some things affect diffusion. I want you to pause the video here and write down what you think that might be. So the following things affect diffusion. The concentration gradient, as we talked about earlier, whether it's a high concentration gradient, so a big difference, or a low concentration gradient. Temperature. The distance particles must travel, as we talked about when we looked at the alveoli. And surface area. Diffusion is much quicker when there is that steep or high concentration gradient. When there's a higher temperature, diffusion happens much quicker, and this is easier to imagine when you are using hot water and a tea bag. So if you've ever boiled a kettle and added it into a tea bag, you'll see that diffusion happens really quickly. So the tea particles or the water gets brown quite quickly. If you're like me and occasionally forget to boil the kettle, when you add that cold water to your tea bag, it doesn't diffuse very quickly. It takes a really long time for the water to go brown because the particles need that little bit of kinetic energy that heat gives them to speed it up. Shorter distance, as we talked about with looking at the two people, the shorter the distance, of course, the particles are going to spread there quicker. So if you're stood right next to a smile and somebody stood 100 meters away, it's going to take much longer for the particles to diffuse there. And finally, a large surface area. So as we'll see in a minute, parts of our body are adapted to give a really large surface area, which means there's more space for the work to be done. Think about if you screwed up a piece of paper into a teeny tiny ball, it doesn't take up much space. But if you then laid that paper out flat, it creates a really large surface area. So one of the parts in our bodies that is specially adapted for diffusion is the small intestine. So here is the diagram of the small intestine. I want you to pause the video and tell me how you think it's adapted for diffusion. So the small intestine is adapted in a few ways. The lumpy bits you can see are called villi, and the villi create a really large surface area. If you were to iron them out so they were flat, it would take up a large space, which means it's a large surface area, and that means there's more space to get the work done. There's also the network of capillary blood vessels that are running through them. Now that means that there is a constant blood supply, which means there's a really steep concentration gradient. So the difference is big, so it will happen a lot quicker. Also, capillaries are one cell thick, meaning that there is less distance for diffuse substances to travel, meaning that it will happen a lot quicker. So the final thing I'd like you to do is to think about where diffusion takes place in your own home. So have a look around and try and find some everyday real life examples. I hope this was helpful, and tune in for part 2 of cell transport in the next video. Bye.